Well, that's good. It's good to see you all. When I was a young man, only 20 years old, I had this calling from God to be a preacher, and I didn't know what that meant. So I went to my pastor and I asked him. I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do? I felt the Lord calling me to preach, but I've never known anybody close who was a preacher. So what am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go?" So he said, "Well, there's only one seminary." I thought that was kind of unique. And he said, "It's out in Texas." And I thought, oh my goodness, I'd never been that far away from home. I was in South Florida. So I said, "Well, what's it called?" And he told me. So off I went. I took my old car, packed it full of what I had, and took off. Of course, when I got to Texas, I found Texas had a reputation of having the biggest everything since it was such a big state. I kept hearing all these stories about how big Texas was. You all remember the story about the Texan who went to Hawaii, and the guy in Hawaii says, "Man, we're just so glad to have you here. And I guess I've heard you Texans have everything so big." He said, "Oh yeah, we got the biggest mosquitoes in the world." And the guy said, "Oh, that's something." He said, "We got the biggest ocean in the world." He said, "We just have everything the biggest." And the guy from Texas said, "Oh man, no, we Texans have everything the biggest." And the guy from Hawaii came back and said, "Oh, let me ask you this. Do you have any volcanoes as big as we do?" And the Texan said, "No, but I tell you what we do. We have a fire department in Waco can put it out." So when I came to Fort Worth, Texas to go to seminary, I heard all those kind of stories. And it turned out that I stayed in Texas for many years after I graduated from seminary. I fell in love with Texas. But there's one thing about Texas that's always kind of bothered me, and that is that Texans, more than anybody else in America, I think, are people who are just obsessed with bigness. Texans love big. I guess most all of us Americans are caught up in the culture of bigness. We love big houses. We love big churches. We love big crowds. We love big plans. We love big amounts of money. I mean, let's face it, when you think about it, whatever you got, would you like one that's bigger? Would you like bigger money, bigger places, bigger things? Well, I think most Americans are just obsessed with this idea that bigger is always better. But when you look at the Bible and look at what God has done throughout all these many thousands of years, you find that our Father does not play by our big game rules. Our Father sometimes turns the table. In fact, he very often is not impressed with the bigness of outside. He keeps choosing small things, tiny places, little people, overlooked things. Our Father tries to teach us some lessons, and I hope today that as we study another of these words that introduce us to what we're going to learn with intensity in the letter to the Colossians, I hope we can catch a little bit of the vision of how God looks at things and how we should. He sent our Lord Jesus not to a giant palatial place, but to a tiny village called Bethlehem. And he sent him there as an example of how he loved to take the smallest, weakest, most unimportant looking and do something unimaginably wonderful. When you look at the Old Testament, you'll see dozens of stories like the story of Gideon. Gideon was as shocked as we are when God took this man who was the smallest from the smallest place and the weakest man who could be a leader in the military. And he told God, he said, "This doesn't make sense. I'm just too small. I'm too weak. I don't know any of this stuff." And God says, "Well, then you're just the right man for the job." And you remember whenever God got tired of all these leaders, these kings and military leaders who tried to organize all the divisions in the country of Israel, as we know it in those days, the Promised Land. So many divisions, so much meanness, so much cruelty. When you read the Old Testament, it's amazing how much evil there was going on, even with the kings and the priests. And when God said, all right, it's time for us to get just the right kind of leader. So who did he pick? Everybody thought he would pick the tallest, strongest, most powerful man of all. And God said, no, that's not what I want. So he went and he found, of all things, from the cheapest kind of job, he picked a poor, small in stature shepherd boy. And you remember he said, you're going to be my leader. I imagine David thought to himself, man, you have picked the wrong one. Here I am, a nobody. And how am I going to stand up to all these people? But somehow God put it in his heart. He used this small guy. And it's no wonder when Jesus came to earth, you remember what Jesus did? When he talked about his kingdom, he didn't talk about it like people do. We're the most powerful, the biggest, the most wonderful. No, what did Jesus compare his kingdom to? He said, my kingdom is like what? A mustard seed, the smallest of all the seeds in the garden. Jesus used the illustration of the mustard seed is what his kingdom is like. And we could take some time to just think about, what did all that mean? Well, we know for one thing, it certainly meant that our God, our Father, loves, and he is made up of those who care about the small things, those who care about the little things, not just the big flashy things that other people see. Paul said it this way: God chose things the world considers foolish to shame the wise. Our Heavenly Father is very much interested in that which is little, not just for him, but for you and me. And we're going to talk about what all that means today as we look at another word that introduces us to the letter to Colossians. Now, folks, remember this. We've been stuck on this introduction for several weeks when I've been teaching. And I want you to go back in your mind and remember that Paul had a reason for writing this letter to the Colossians, to the Christians in Colossae. And I want you to remember, if you can, that as we learn these key words at the beginning, they weren't chosen by accident. Paul very deliberately starts off this letter, which is the epitome of all the works in the Bible that tell us about the uniqueness of Jesus. And in doing, I think we will understand more about what Paul is saying as we go through this letter if we understand these words that I've already talked about. Words like Jesus, apostle, and so forth. Now, today we're going to look at this word Colossae. He starts off this letter and he says, I'm Paul, an apostle, that God has chosen me to speak to write to the Colossians. Who are these Colossians? You'll remember Paul's in the prison there in Rome. And you remember that he sat down and wrote a letter back in Colossae, a good ways away from Rome. And I want us to think about why he chose to write this to this little old town that's sort of a no place. When I went to college right out of high school and just barely got in, when I started studying, and then I was barely able to stay in college because I was on a probation. My grades were so bad that the people who gave me a loan to go to college said that if you have to maintain at least a C plus average or you're out. Well, you remember when God called me to preach, all of a sudden somehow I had this desire and this ability to get the grades they wanted me to get. And I started doing well. And I changed my major from art to sociology and psychology. Sociology or psychology is a study more about the individual and how they think, how they behave, and why they think this way and why they behave this way. Sociology is how groups think and how groups behave. It's the study of society, the study of people's activities. So I figured, well, I better get to know something about sociology if I'm going to be dealing with church people. Every church I bet in had trouble. Everybody was either fussing or fighting or doing something. I said, I better find out how to fix all that. So I took sociology. Well, it didn't help me much. But anyway, I studied sociology, and the first day I was in class, it was a shocker. So when I went to the class, the professor stood up and asked this very unusual question for me. He said, let's begin by letting me ask you this. Are morals absolute? Morals absolute? And I thought to myself, well, of course they are. I've always been taught that God gave us things that are good for us and things that are in that way we should do things. There's certain things that are right, there are things that are wrong. It doesn't make any difference because the Ten Commandments says, thou shalt not kill or murder. And it means it's good in America and it's good in Europe. It meant that, this is not just for some people, this is for all people. Morals are absolute, they don't change. Now, we may change some things, but God's morals don't change. Well, I was thinking all that, but I didn't know exactly how to say it, so I kept my mouth shut on my first day in class. But one girl acted like she was fearless, and she stood up and she said, "No, morals are not absolute. They are man-made and change with time and change in every culture." And I thought, uh-oh, here we go. Well, sure enough, she went on to say, I'm living with a boy, and he and I have intimate relationships any way that we want to and any time we want to. And I thought, oh, my soul. And then she went on to say, I have some friends who go to church and they say I'm immoral. And she said, I'm not immoral. She said, what they're saying is, I don't agree with a bunch of old men who decided 1,000 years ago that it's wrong to do the things that I'm doing. What do I care what these old men think? And by the way, they're just a bunch of old men. We young girls ought to be able to decide what we do with our bodies any way we want to. It's our bodies, we own them. And she went on to make her case. Basically, her case was very simple. And that is, I should be able to do whatever I want to do. And that's what is moral. Well, I'm wondering as I sat there, I came from the kind of church where we didn't really have anybody who would say that sort of thing. And I thought to myself, that first day in the sociology class, I wonder, how is society going to be if people just do whatever they think is okay, regardless of what anybody else thinks? What kind of a homes are we going to have? I kept thinking all that. Well, lo and behold, there are many parts of our culture today and the cultures throughout the world, as I see them reported and read about them, that have this philosophy, this idea, this belief that what is right, what's good for me, what's good for the society I live in is whatever I think and not what some bunch of old men in a committee decides. So how do we do that? How do we make those how do you make those kind of decisions? I mean, literally, how do you make that kind of decision over and over again because it never stops? Well, that's what Paul is talking about here, and we're going to see how important that is and how he says we should be that kind of person. I wonder from most of you as you're sitting there, I don't expect any answer that is perfect. I'm just wondering some of your thoughts. What are you? We have a small group here this morning, so let's just all pitch in and give our thoughts. How can we know? How do we decide? I mean, not just what we're supposed to do, but how do you and I decide what is the best thing for us when we make a decision? What is the truth? Not what somebody has told us, so there's a lie or it's a truth, but how do we know something is going to turn out for the best? Maybe I'll put it this way. What are the things that influence us? And how do we make a decision about what is the best for me? How does that work? Anybody willing to just give me your thoughts? What are some of the things that come to your mind?
Our experience and our relationships.
All right, good. I think that's very true. What else? What else helps you make your
No,
decision?
I think what I got is if it feels good, do it.
Yep. Yep. I think that's pretty central in our culture, especially because
That's
it's Roger, do you think the person who thinks that way, and maybe you all think that way somewhat, does the person think that therefore feelings are basically good?
well, I think that if you are tuned into the Lord, when you are going to do the right thing, you will feel good about it because the Lord is constantly assuring you or challenging you. So if you have the mind of Christ, you'll know from a feeling, and that is a feeling of comradeship and the loyalty. And so if it feels good, do it. And many times when I'm getting ready to do something, I know from my relationship with the Lord, it's not a good thing. So I still, so that's kind of mine. If it feels good, do it. I kind of like that philosophy.
Why do you do them anyway? I
Well,
think
yeah, Fred,
one of the things that we don't really want to add up to is we make decisions a lot by what will others think.
very strong, very strong. I wonder where we got that, Fred. Where did we get the idea, or where did we get the process of doing what we think other people will like?
Our pride.
That's right. I think so.
Well, I
Anybody?
think
Did I see Elaine? Did I see your hand?
I was gonna say, if I'm not sure, then I wanna step back and pray about it. Because if I pray, then the answer comes.
And what do you think people who don't pray about it, where do they get their decision?
I'm not sure.
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure.
But going back to what Fred said about, I think sometimes it's maybe the way we were raised also. And especially girls, a lot of times they are raised to please people or do the right thing. And so some of that may come from your background.
That's good. I think that's a powerful, powerful influence on all of us. Well, yeah, yeah.
I always, one of my favorite verses is Matthew 6:33, and that's seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And that really helps me. But let me just give you an example. My son, well, he had friends come from Canada, and it was, male and female. And I know they probably were living together, but when they came, I put lights on in 2 bedrooms, knowing, they won't be sleeping together in my house. And then the same thing happened many years ago. Our son came and they weren't married yet. And, and the same thing happened. And he wasn't really happy with me for quite a few months. But I still felt like I did the right thing. However, I'm getting weaker because everybody does it.
Well, that's a very important statement that you just made. Everybody's doing it. When the numbers go up of people who say it's right, when the odds are overwhelmingly from a group that you disagree with, there is the temptation, isn't there, to say, well, it looks like everybody believes that. Maybe it's what I ought to just go along with. I mean, there's a lot of pressure there. Well, let's move on. Yeah, Phyllis, I see that hand.
Okay, I'm glad you're in that seat today and I'm back in my lounge chair, by the way. It's very interesting that early on in human existence, humans started measuring things, everything from miles to kilometers to feet to a teaspoon to a yardstick. And we kind of accept those measurements, they're standard. And if we start changing all those tools of measurement, boy, we get in a chaotic mess in a hurry. And I've said this to the class before. You got to decide what your yardstick is. What's your measuring tool? And I think for me, of course, I had the blessing of having um, good parents who took me to church and who disciplined me and taught me. I got a strong should and ought system, but they taught me that my measuring stick ought to be God's word. What does God's word say about this? And I hear you, Judy, but I agree with you. I think you did the right thing because you stuck to God's measuring stick. And if we keep changing it, which is what we've done in our beautiful country in the last 3 decades, changing that measuring stick is not going to create anything but chaos.
Thank you. You know, I really appreciate that, Phyllis, because I found too that sometimes I have to. In fact, it was back when I was a little younger. I decided that my measuring stick was going to be Jesus, and I'll tell you why. Because I found I had so many preacher colleagues, even professors, who used the Bible as their standard, but they could believe almost anything they want to. Because if you look hard enough and you got a good computer, you can find a scripture to back up any kind of nonsense. I think religious people over the years, ever since what we call the Dark Ages, we've discovered that for people to figure out what's right and wrong, uh, if they use the Bible, they can come up with anything. But I tell you what, you have a hard time. Oh, you can probably do it, but you have a harder time letting your standard be the words and the actions of Jesus, who is my standard. I believe that he can give you some pretty good guidelines in his way of reacting. But with all that said, let me just say this. It's a very interesting thing that Paul, sitting in prison, knowing this could be his last word and his last writing, his last effort to follow the will of the Lord Jesus, Paul chose to write a letter to the Christians in Colossae. Why in the world did he do that? Now, as we get ready to study the rest of his letter and the principles that he's going to teach us, which are going to be our standard, looking at Jesus. Who is he? What does he want us to do? Remember this. Why did Paul write these people? He could have written people in cities all over the world. Remember, he had been to Athens, the most powerful city on the earth. He had been to Rome, and there he is now in a prison. Why did he write this letter to that one little old bitty town? Well, some people say he wrote it because it was a report from Epaphras that changed him. You remember Epaphras, he was the founder of the church in Colossae. Paul had sent him there. Paul's never been to Colossae. But this young man had been there and started this church among some believers. And as he built the church, he began to find out they had the same problem that a lot of churches were having. And that is that many of the people were being told that now that it had been, not too long, really, now that it had only been 20 years, maybe since Jesus had died and resurrected, many of the people were being taught that Jesus was not really God. Jesus was a good man, a good speaker, and a very moral man. It's all right to follow the way he acted, but don't get overexcited about it. There's not much he can do about it. He's dead. So Paul had seen this before, but because Epaphras said these people need some help, Paul wrote this letter to clear up this whole idea that you can live by the Greek and Roman philosophy, which was dominating the world. He was writing in response to Epaphras' letter. His visit to him, now that Epaphras was there in the prison with Paul. The second reason some scholars say the reason Paul wrote this letter is because of the recognition of their potential. What does that mean? It means that Paul looked at Colossae and said, yes, they're small, they're a tiny town, but they're right in the center of most of the places where I started churches or where other people started churches, and they could be a hub for this information. Thirdly, some say he wrote it because of the record of their relationship. You're going to notice when we read the very first paragraph in the letter to the Colossians, Paul says in the very first letter, and then he's going to repeat it many times. And I think we'll spend some time talking about this letter. Paul said to you, I'm writing you because of your faith. Basically, he said writing it because of your exemplary faith, your powerful faith, the fact that you stood up against all this stuff. In other words, he started off very positive. And, we might learn something from that. Paul starts his letter off not by chewing them out, not by talking about the people in the church that were bad dogs. He started out by telling there's some people in there that are not paying attention to these folks who are lying, that are sticking to the truth. So Paul starts out by bragging about their faithfulness, and he goes on to say, not only do you have faithfulness, that the testimony of your faithfulness is all over Europe. And he talks about their witness. He also talks about their love. He said, your reputation of loving each other and taking care of each other is all over the place. So many people say he wrote this letter because these people were having all this trouble and they needed encouragement because, yes, they were faithful. Yes, they were showing the love of Christ that he taught us. But they needed to hear from the man that was considered the missionary of all, the man who started the revolution by spreading the gospel more than anybody has in the history of the world. And they said, we want to hear what Paul has to say. And Paul started right out by saying, I'm writing you because you are the Christians who have become the faithful, the loving, the great testimony and reputation of Jesus. Well, I think this is good to know. You and I can learn a lesson as we study Colossians, not only of what Jesus was and is, but also of what he expects of us as we follow this example. Now, I'd like you to remember this too. This is very important. This is very important because you remember the letter to Colossians is just one of the letters written by Paul while he was in the prison there in Rome. There's a group of those letters that Paul wrote because he felt they were all facing the same temptation, the same problem with these liars, these deceivers who were spreading in tremendous ability they had to teach. Remember this, when Satan sends out a message to you to try and mess up your thinking and your beliefs and your actions, he's not going to send some dumb bunny. Satan is going to send a smart person. He's going to send a great deceiver, something to make you think, maybe that's true. I hadn't thought of that. That's exactly what Paul was saying. He said it in Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, all those letters from the prison. Paul said to them, you need to know the difference between the truth and lying, no matter how intelligent, no matter how outstanding the debate is. I'm going to tell you, you need a, and I'm going to tell you how I can tell the difference. Do you remember this? Paul had been to Athens. Yes, he was in Rome in prison, but before this, you remember he'd been to Athens. You know what's in Athens? In Athens is the head of the world at that time. Before the Romans took over, Athens was the intellectual capital of the world. In fact, Athens was a place where you and I, some of you have been there like I have. When I went to Athens, the first place I wanted to go was to Mars Hill. It's also called the Acropolis. I went to also called it overlooks the Acropolis. It was also called the Areopagus. The Aero, I'm sorry, my tongue's a little twisted. Areopagus. I wanted to do, I like calling it Mars Hill. It's easier. Anyway, I wanted to go to Mars Hill because you remember what Mars Hill is? I've got a picture here. I hope you can see it all right. Here it is. Now, today it's not as beautiful. Today it's not as beautiful as it was in those days, but you can get the picture. Right here is the Acropolis. The Acropolis was sort of like our Capitol in Washington. The Acropolis was a place that had buildings that were for each of the departments of the Greek government that was taking over the world. Each of those departments, military, education, medicine, and so forth, all those different departments of government, that was the Acropolis. Now, here is Mars Hill, Areopagus. I can get it out. The Areopagus was this place right here, which is a flat top of a mountain overlooking the Acropolis. Now, what is important? The Areopagus was a place where that was called the highest point. That's what that word means. And you could see as you stood there, like these people right here, they're looking at the Acropolis. Now, when I went to Athens, I'll never forget, I took the group that I was leading and we went up there. And whenever we saw it, I said, I want to read what Paul said. I want to say it, and I want you to picture that I'm Paul the Apostle. And here's what I want you to hear what Paul said when he stood in that place that I stood. And I tell you what, I had chills running up my back, thinking, here's where Paul the Apostle, because it's solid stone, it's solid granite. I said, this is the exact place where Paul stood. He pointed his finger over at the Acropolis, and here's what he said: Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. You're very interested in spiritual things, the spirit world, the source of power outside of yourselves. For as I was walking along and saw your many shrines, one of these altars had this inscription on it: to an unknown God. I can just see him now pointing even straighter at him. And he's saying, this God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about. He doesn't need to be unknown. He has now made himself known. He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples. The human hands can't even serve his needs, for he has no needs. Paul went on to say, he himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. From the one man, He created all the nations of this world throughout the entire whole earth. Paul then went on to tell them, as you do know, he went on to tell them that Jesus was God come to earth. Now, think about this for a moment. Paul was in Athens and he was speaking to the most intelligent, most educated, most powerful people in the world. And he was using their technique of argument because the Acropolis was the place where people came to have open debate. And if you remember from our previous study, Paul was a master debater. He took all the college courses in debate and rhetoric. So he was a very accomplished speaker. And here's what he started with. You noticed in his writing, he started with the idea that you have some things you think are the truth. Now, let me tell you what I know. And he outlined for them, if you look closely, Paul outlined to the Athenians, and he's also outlining to the Romans, and he's also outlining to you and me. He's saying, this is the way you think. This is the way you believe. He had 4 beliefs. They're called the Aristotelian beliefs. You all know that Aristotle was the father of Greek philosophy. Let me put that in everyday language. Aristotle was the first guy who summarized the way people in Athens, the powerful intellectual people of the world, he summarized what their main beliefs were, what it was built on. I believe today, as I spent my graduate years studying philosophy and studying Aristotle, I believe the same basic beliefs that the Athenians had are the same beliefs that's causing us all the confusion in our culture. Let me tell you, I'll tell you briefly, because we're not going to have time to do all I hope we do today. Here are the 4 things that Paul summarizes when he told them, using their method of debate. He says, here's what you say you believe. First of all, you say truth equals understanding. In other words, if you want to know the truth, you can find it only by being understanding, by being taught, by being educated. The key to knowing truth, knowing what is the best, knowing what is good for our families and for our country and for the world, is to be educated. Paul's setting them up, as you notice, because he's saying if you want to know the truth, all you need to do is educate. Well, who's going to educate you? The same dumbos that have got you all messed up already. But he didn't say it that way. I'm just saying it. Ask yourself, do you make your decisions? Do you say, I find the truth by being educated, by reading the people who sound the most logical, who sound the most intelligent, the people who seem to be at the top, the people who got the most followers, the ones who write a book and more people read that book than any other book. They sell millions of copies. You say, well, then they must be right. Paul says, you decide on the truth by saying who is the most understanding and who is the most educated. He said, the second thing you hold, as Aristotle said, the second thing you use in finding the truth, or he called the principles for success and understanding, is that good equals what makes sense. Aristotle taught if you want to know what is good versus bad, like Judy was talking about, is it good? Is it okay to sleep around? Is it not good? Is it bad? Is it immoral? The Athenians, Aristotle taught to know the difference between good and bad. The way you do that is ask yourself, does this make sense? Is it logical? And is it something that is going to be able to be reasonable to you tomorrow as you look back on it? Well, of course, Aristotle and Plato both had this idea of logic. It's just 2 and 2 equals 4. You have to make sure it's logical. You know what? I think the young people of our culture start out as children, and we're basically taught in science, as we could this morning talk about it. Science, I'm a very much a believer in science because our bodies are just the perfect example of science. We believe in experience from theory. In other words, we believe that if a thing can be proven logical, that it works. And that's what is the best. That is what the truth is. So Aristotle said good equals making sense. If it doesn't make sense, if it's not logical, don't do it. If it makes sense to you and to the group, then follow it. Well, you can see how Paul was going to have a heyday with that one. The third Aristotelian principle was the principle that function equals value. He's saying to know a thing's value, to know what is valuable, what is lasting, what is good for everybody and good for you, is to discover what its purpose is and if it works. We call that in America pragmatism. If this thing you're doing works out the best for more people, then it's good. You know what? We Americans say it. We don't say it like Aristotle. We say it this way. If more people vote for it, it's good. If more people follow it and it works for them, it's good. In other words, if cheating makes you rich, then cheating's okay. If not cheating makes you poor, you should cheat. You don't want to be poor. Aristotle's principle, function equals value. That is to say, if it's functional, if it works, it's valuable. Do you believe that? It's very tempting. Paul is telling these people, listen, I've been where you are. I was with the intellectual. I was with the educated. I was with the most powerful army. And I thought that because they were so powerful and it was working and they were conquering the world, the Roman, I thought, he's basically saying, look, just because it works doesn't mean it's good. It's right. We'll learn that in just a minute. And then the last thing Aristotle taught is the spiritual equals mental. That is, that which is unknown, that which is the energy of the universe, the cosmos, that which we can't understand, that which we can't understand, but we know is powerful. That, like the Greeks had this belief in the gods. He didn't get into all that. Aristotle said, forget all that. Just think of the whole mystical world that we don't know beyond life after death. That whole mysterious world out there. He said this, if you realize it, that whole world out there is mental. It's all in your mind. And he said, if you can simply have a peace of mind, you've found the best of the spiritual world. That's kind of like it's said today. To be spiritual is to be peaceful in your mental activity. In fact, I suppose these days, if not the most important, probably the most successful books on Amazon are books on spirituality. In fact, I would entitle them Spirituality Without Jesus. What that means is you can find a spiritual peace. You can find all of that. All you have to do is to practice certain elements. And if you do, you can have a peaceful environment. Do I think that finding techniques to help you have physical peace are wrong? No. Finding a physical peace sometimes it takes things like exercise, like breathing, like I do it myself, guided imagery, like yoga. We do all those things because we have a physical body and we have a brain that's made out of muscles and tissue and fibers. But let me tell you something. There's something beyond the physical. And if you want spiritual peace, if you want spiritual forgiveness, if you want a sense of eternity, Aristotle was wrong, Paul is basically going to tell us that being spiritual beyond the physical, that being spiritual beyond it is more than a mental exercise. There's an element of trust, of faith, of commitment to that which created us. So let me just say it this way. Paul set them up basically when he started talking about men of Athens. Let me tell you what I see. He's saying, I see that you think you can get truth by just studying. Paul said, I think you can find out what's the best for you and your family by just trying to do what's logical. He's saying, I know you folks. You think that something's valuable if it works, if it'll make you successful on this earth. He's saying you think that you found spirit, you found a truth. No, not because you just got your mind all set up and you think you can out debate anybody. Let me tell you what I think. You've invited me here. The Athenians invited him, put him on the agenda because they heard his revolution was going all over the world. They said, we got to hear from this guy. So they pulled him out of prison and let him stand up there. And Paul spoke to the Athenians. He said, let me tell you what I think. That's why you brought me here. Truth is not found through me being educated or understanding more than the rest of the people. It's found by following the creator of all knowledge, the creator of everything on this earth. Truth does not equal understanding. Truth equals following. You know what? You and I need to make that basic, I mean, very bottom line decision somewhere along the line. Am I going to say a thing is true because most everybody believes it? Because it's very popular, because it's make me money? It's going to give me whatever I want? No. Paul says, let me tell you something. Knowing the truth, knowing what's true is by following the truth maker, following the creator. What did he say? What did he do? Look at what God the Father has done for centuries, and especially, and he would go on to say, we're going to find out in Colossians, Paul's going to say, look at God who came to earth so we could see an example of what truth is walking around. Look at Jesus. If you follow Jesus, you're going to find the truth. Not if you start trying to understand stuff, you're just going to get all mixed up. People know how to talk better than you do. They know how to think better. They know how to argue better than you do. They're smarter than you are. You're going to find the truth if you say, I don't care what all you people say. I'm following Jesus because he is God in flesh. The second thing he said, you're not going to find what's good versus what's bad by just common sense. No, common sense may get you into deep trouble. You say it makes sense to me. Makes sense to me. Look at all these people who are getting successful. Makes sense to me. He said, I don't care what you think makes sense to you. Let me tell you, if you want to know what's good, he said, just know this, that good equals duplication, not sense. Meaning, just duplicate your thinking, your actions to do what Jesus did. If you do what Jesus did, you may be having to go do some things that don't still feel comfortable. You may have to sacrifice, which seems hard. You may have to put up with a lot of stuff. You may have to take all kind of punishment that doesn't seem fair. But if you do what Jesus did, guided by his spirit, guess what? You will find out what is good. Haven't we found that out? Haven't we who have suffered things that seem very unfair? And in the midst of the suffering, when we give ourselves to Jesus and follow his pattern of talking to the Father and of surrounding ourselves with people like these in this room and in our home, don't we say to ourselves, boy, I have found the good life? That's what Phyllis and I prayed this morning in our morning devotion. When you have that sense of following Jesus, doing what he did, nothing can take away that sense of the peace of Christ in your life. Paul said to those people, you know what? You think that just because a thing works, short term. You think that that's the most valuable thing because it's making you a buck or it's getting you, you're able to get your own way. Paul said, that's not it. He said, be function, that is, make things that work. The value is found not by if it works, the value is found by making the creator's values, the creator's goals, your goals. What is your goal? Where are you heading? You know what? If you keep in your mind where you're heading, what your values are, the decision is made before you get there. I know we were, Phyllis and I were talking about our granddaughter this week. She's made some decisions about the future. And as she follows this pattern of those decisions, it doesn't make any difference what comes along. She still has that goal that she's still looking towards. And we're so proud that her values are determined by her Savior Jesus, not by what's coming along or what's offered. No matter the dollars, no matter the ease, the question is this what Jesus would have me do? And you're going to say to yourself, or Satan's going to say to you, yeah, but how do you know what Jesus wants you? You follow Jesus and you find out what he wants you to do. You don't find out what he wants you to do and then start following him. Forget it. You decide who Jesus is. You know what I think the big problem is for those who call themselves Christians and yet go out and make these stupid decisions? They haven't really decided who Jesus is. Paul, we're going to find out over and over and over again. He's going to tell us in Colossians, you follow Jesus because when you realize that I saw Jesus, I heard Jesus' voice, his spirit comes to live in me. Jesus is in me. That means God himself in some unusual, unexplainable way, God's spirit is in me. I really believe Jesus was God in flesh. And Jesus, when he rose, he says in other letters that Jesus is now spirit and he can live in you. When you get captivated by the idea that Jesus lives in you, this is not some fellow who lived 2,000 years ago. No, when it captivates you that Jesus lives in you, you know, when that happens, it changes things. Your values, your goals, your peace are all changed by the awareness and the commitment to the fact that Jesus is who he says he is and he is with you. Well, as I looked at these things that Paul has taught us, that these are what the Athenians think. And then by debate, he's basically saying, no, I'm telling you the real truth about the creator and and he came to earth, that's Jesus. When he says that, he can now come back and write this letter in its fullness and help us see the power of it all. I was going to spend some time talking about the least of these. One of the things I like about this word Colossians, the word Colossae was a small town surrounded by all these big towns. You know, there are over 1 million people in Rome, in Athens. And then if you look at all those little towns around him, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Hierapolis, all these towns around Colossae. Do you know how big Colossae was? Colossae only had about 20,000 people. 20,000. It's not bigger, much bigger than Cairo, where Phyllis lives, grew up. I mean, can you imagine Paul, the great world leading missionary? Can you imagine if he's in prison? He thinks he doesn't know, but he says, I may die. And he thinks, well, before I die, there's one thing I want to do. I want to write a letter to the Christians in Colossae, to the Christians in Cairo. What? Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why didn't he pick out a big town? Why didn't he pick out a mega church? Why would he write Colossae? Well, some scholars say, well, because his friend Epaphras said those people have a lot of trouble. Some say, well, because it was just a bunch of smart people over there. No, he wrote it because God led him. The Spirit of God led him. All these other things added to that determination. But listen to me. Paul knew this. He said it very clearly as I read to you other thing. God sometimes chooses the smallest, the weakest, the most nobody for this purpose, to let people see that he has made this a miracle. And sure enough, what happened? Let me tell you what happened. Those people in Colossae took that letter and began not only to spread the word, send it around and go around and read it, and they copied it. They multiplied it by hand, and they carried it around and gave it to these churches, and these churches gave it to others, and others started. And next thing you know, you have thousands, then millions of Christians, because these people were on fire for Jesus. They loved Jesus. I think Paul's obsession with Jesus, when I look at all this, is very important. I'm going to talk to you about that the next time I'm speaking to you, but I want to end it by saying this because our time's about gone. You know what I love about this? Paul's in this prison, chained to this wall, but still writing a letter. And you know what he cared about? He cared about those Christians in that little tiny church. Some people would say it doesn't make sense, but he didn't make his decisions based on what makes sense. They'd say that don't make sense. He ought to be writing a letter to the church in Philadelphia or one of those big towns. Some people would say, "Oh, I know he's writing this letter because I think those people are all rich." No, he knew they were poor. Paul did this because he knew when God opened a door and told him to do something, it didn't make any difference whether it made sense. What he did is he cared for the thing. He moved out. He did what the Lord's Spirit moved in his spirit. Listen to me. Phyllis is a musician, and she taught me about an interesting word. Have you ever heard the word earworm? An earworm? Phyllis, what's an earworm?
It's when you get a little song that you hear early in the day and you just it stays in your mind. You can't get it off your mind. You're humming it, you're whistling it, you're singing it all day long.
Exactly. Well, some people say an earworm is not only a song or a tune that you get in your head, you can't get it out, but some say an earworm is anything that you get in your head, in your heart, in your emotions that you just can't get rid of. You just burn up with it. Even the harder you try to get rid of it, the more it's there. Brain experts, I read about this, Phyllis, brain experts say the reason that we have these earworms is they are a reflection of our emotions. Put it another way, we just get these things in our minds and they just stir us and stir us and stir us. We can't get them out of our mind because there's something God's trying to tell us. There's something he wants to plant in our emotions, in our heart. He's wanting us to do something about. I think Paul had a Jesus earworm. Jesus was in his brain. I don't care where he was. I don't care if he's on a mountaintop with all the brainy people in Mars Hill, or if he was in a dungeon just with a couple of old guys sitting in the dirt. Paul had this earworm for Jesus. He just kept wanting to tell them about Jesus. He told prison guards, he told anybody, if he was brought before a king or a judge, he'd say, "Well, I'll tell you something. Let me tell you what happened to me on the road to Damascus. I met this Jesus and he's changed my life." What am I saying this to you? Because when Paul wrote Colossians, we're going to find out he had an earworm. You and I need to realize that Jesus' Spirit lives in us. And how does he speak to me? I'm going to tell you how he speaks to me. I don't know how he speaks to you. He speaks in all these ways we talk about when we read the Bible, when we hear a song, when all these things. But mainly he speaks to us through our conscience, that eternal part of us. He nudges us. And maybe you're out on the job building a ramp, and there's something in your mind, something in your conscience, something in your mind that says, talk to that person. Just say a good word. And then at the end of it, tell them, Jesus put this on my heart. Or say, can I pray for you? I want to talk to Jesus for you. I was at a place here not long ago, and I was telling this nurse how certain things had happened in my life. And I said, well, you mind if I pray for you? And she said, oh, I would love that. Nobody ever asked me that. I said, well, let me pray for you. So I just bowed my head. I said, bless this woman. Jesus, take care of her. She's got some problems. You know what? It doesn't make any difference if it's a big crowd or if it's just one or two people, or maybe it's just that one old man. Maybe it's that one lonely woman. Maybe it's that person who kind of looks like they've had a hard day, and you say something to them to encourage them. I'm wondering if you're doing what Paul did to the Colossians. You care about the individual. Jesus came to save the whole world. But let me tell you something, folks. When you read about him, he was more interested in the one, in the individual. How about you? We can pray for the whole world peace. But how about that one person that you could call, you could write, you could take something to? Jesus wants us to be like Paul was to the Colossians, to care about the individual. And I'll tell you the rest of the story later, but our time is all up. I'll turn it out over. Let's see, I guess, Les, you're the man.
Thank you, Bill. Les had to go back to the church. So this is Jim, and I just